Hello, this is Bill Worrell with Virginia Cooperative Extension. For today's episode of 15 Minutes in the Forest, I'm going to take you to look at riparian buffers, and we're going to talk about how they impact aquatic wildlife habitat and species such as the Eastern Hellbender.
Hey everyone, my name is Wally Smith. I'm an Associate Professor of Biology at the University of Virginia's College at Wise. We're here today along the banks of the Clinch River in St. Paul, Virginia, to talk about how private landowners in Virginia can improve and manage their habitat to benefit aquatic wildlife like hellbenders, which I'm holding here. I know a few years ago we did one of these programs with 15 Minutes in the Forest on the Eastern Hellbender, so I won't go back and rehash everything about that species, but if you're not familiar with them, Eastern Hellbenders are a really fascinating member of Virginia's amphibian fauna. They get about 2 feet in length, and I've got a model here to show you. This is not a real hellbender. If it was, it would be much more squirmy than the one I'm holding now, but this is a scale model just showing the size of this animal. They're really fascinating because most salamanders, if you're familiar with, our typical salamanders in a forest or a stream, they tend to get about, 3 to 4, maybe 5 inches long, but these once again get up to about 2 feet in length. So they're a really fascinating animal. They're also very interesting because of where they live. So they tend to live in our larger rivers and streams in Virginia, specifically in the New River Valley to the southwest. So the Ohio River tributaries, the Tennessee River tributaries, that's where you're going to find them. And in a stream like this one, you're not typically going to see a hellbender unless maybe you're fishing and catch one by accident, or you just happen to cross one. And that's because hellbenders typically are going to live underneath the larger boulders and rocks and bedrock slabs in that stream. So they're typically hidden out of sight. While they're there, they're primarily going to eat crayfish, so there's some myths about them eating game fish populations, but those aren't necessarily true. They're primarily crayfish eaters. And they have some really interesting reproductive biology where they're going to choose a nesting rock, so a nice flat rock typically with a space or cavity underneath it on the river bottom. They're going to reproduce there, they're going to lay their eggs there, and then they kind of flip the script with reproductive biology for a lot of our amphibians and other wildlife, meaning that the males, the hellbender dads, are actually going to be the individuals that are going to care for those eggs. So they're going to stay with those eggs under that rock and help care for them until they hatch. And I mention that because hellbenders right now in Virginia and all across their range are declining at a very rapid rate. And the reason for that primarily goes to declines in water quality and declines in the habitat that the hellbenders require. As an example of that, there's been some really fascinating research come out of a team led by Virginia Tech researchers in the last year, actually finding that one of the reasons why hellbenders are declining is that the hellbender dads under those cover rocks are actually cannibalizing their own young. So they're eating the eggs or the offspring. And there's a couple of reasons why that can happen in nature. Sometimes that can happen simply due to the fact that something is wrong with that egg clutch and it's likely not to survive. In other cases, the dad or the parent could be stressed, and that physiological stress could lead it to consume its own eggs for nutrition, hoping that it could survive a little bit later on down the road. But for whatever reason, those researchers have found that there's a higher rate of nest failure and fewer hellbender offspring whenever you have less forest cover upstream in a catchment or upstream in a watershed where the hellbender nest is going to be located. And so obviously land use is important to the hellbenders for that reason. We're also finding in some of our work in the Tennessee River drainage here in Southwest Virginia that sites that are degraded and do not have great hellbender habitat tend to also have a lot of fine sediment intrusion, which is just a technical way to say that sediment running off of the landscape goes into the waterway, doesn't stay in the water column, it actually settles out and gets down into those spaces beneath the rocks and between the rocks that the hellbenders need. So what's happening in the watershed is directly relevant to the hellbenders. They're kind of our canary in the coal mine for streams in a lot of ways. So I know that a lot of private landowners in Virginia, unless you have just a huge amount of land, probably can't control the entire land use patterns in that watershed. But you can do a lot in the streamside habitat like we have here, what we call the riparian buffer, to benefit that stream. So I want to talk a little bit today about what you can do on your property. Even if you don't have hellbenders, a lot of what's going to benefit them will benefit other aquatic wildlife. And we're going to see some examples of things you can try, some things to possibly avoid, in ways that you can manage some of your habitat to benefit aquatic critters like the hellbender. So we moved just upriver here to another spot on the Clinch, and I thought this would be a good place to illustrate a really easy practice that landowners can use to help protect water quality on their property, especially if you have land that adjoins the stream bank or streamside habitat. And that's simply protecting what we call a riparian buffer, which is a forested area and vegetated area along the banks of a stream. There's a number of reasons why that can be so important for water quality. One of those is simply because when a precipitation event happens and you have runoff that's coming off of the uplands trying to come down into the waterway, having vegetation here, anchoring that topsoil in, anchoring the sediment in, is going to help to hold that sediment here so it's less likely for it to flow directly into the waterway. In addition to having tree roots here, having vegetation is going to help to slow the flow of that surface runoff. So again, any sediment, chemicals, other pollutants, they're trying to make their way into the waterway, while less of a chance of doing that and will flow more slowly and typically get trapped on the surface of the land before it makes its way into the river. In addition, we're in a floodplain habitat here, so when the Clinch gets a heavy rainfall event, it tends to jump its banks and come up into the floodplain. Once again, having that vegetation here is going to help to slow that sediment that's coming up into that floodplain from running back off into that waterway during the next rainfall event after the flood recedes. In addition as well, riparian buffers can be important because they help to trap those nutrients. It's not just trapping sediment, but it's also trapping the nutrients and energy that run off with that surface runoff towards the stream, meaning that these habitats become supercharged, kind of naturally fertilized with energy and nutrients, again retaining that and helping the overall health of the stream. And then finally, rivers and streams, it's important to remember, are not just ditches that capture surface runoff. They also have groundwater inputs, and having this healthy buffer here, healthy soils as part of that buffer, can help that water percolate down into the groundwater, recharge it, and then ultimately help with the long-term health of that stream. So at a site like this one that has not been disturbed, we're actually in a pretty healthy riparian buffer here behind me. It's great if you've got this kind of habitat on your property to follow what one of my colleagues calls the leave it alone principle, which simply means if you have this kind of intact habitat, leaving it here, making sure it's not disturbed, protecting it from disturbance as wide as you can be important. It is important to remember though that in certain parts of Virginia you may have some state or local regulations that dictate how wide of a buffer you should protect around the waterway. So it's important anytime you're doing any kind of management activity on your property to consult your local officials, possibly your state regulatory officials, and just make sure that you're aware of any regulations that apply to your property. As well here, we've got a little bit of issues with invasive species. There's several different invasive plants that have moved in, and landowners often want to remove those invasives while protecting your buffer. Anytime you're doing that kind of activity and you're thinking about management within a riparian buffer, it's always a good idea to contact your local extension agent, your local USDA office. They're going to have resources and expertise that you can use to better plan a management activity. Some of those offices as well have access to cost share programs. They can actually help fund certain types of riparian buffer protection, restoring riparian buffers that have been disturbed, helping to restore stream banks and stream habitat. They're going to have the expertise and know-how with how to do that. But generally speaking, again, these types of buffers are important to protect. If you have them on your property, try to keep as wide of a forested buffer as you can. And in a couple of minutes, we'll go see some other examples of some degraded buffers, some things you can help to improve on your property beyond what you're seeing here. So we saw earlier an example of an intact forested riparian buffer along the Clinch. I thought we'd come to this site that at first glance may not look that disturbed at all. We still have a lot of trees around us. We've got a good forest canopy here that's shading us and is protecting the stream. But this site exemplifies something that I think a lot of folks don't realize about protecting a buffer and protecting an area from disturbance right along the stream bank. We're standing here in a multi-use trail that's been built to give folks access along the river. This area was improved earlier this year, and it was done by coming in and effectively bulldozing the understory of this area. So the woody vegetation, some of the herbaceous vegetation that was essentially along the forest floor. None of the trees were cut, there was no logging here, so otherwise this area is intact. And it's a good example of why it's important to protect the entirety of the buffer from disturbance as opposed to just the overstory. It's a little hard to tell around me because we're starting to have leaf fall where we're in the autumn season, but here when that happened, that exposed the topsoil, the sediment, to the surface. There was nothing here to anchor it anymore. It also compacted some of that sediment, so when you have rainfall events, you'll see behind me how close this is to the Clinch. There's nothing really here to keep this exposed sediment from washing off into the waterway. And that can happen with something as simple as a road crossing, as a pretty wide trail crossing like you see here. There have been some studies in Southwest Virginia, for example, that have found a single unbridged road crossing or a road or trail crossing that's been built without the proper environmental controls can contribute literal tons of sediment to a nearby waterway each year. So it's something to watch out for, something to consider as well whenever you have a riparian buffer. With terrain, it's not always possible to just rope back all of your roads and trails, completely away from the stream. But trying to prevent what you see here and keeping excavation, disturbance with the land from coming right up to the water line and to the stream bank is a very good practice. Wherever possible as well, make sure to use proper erosion and sediment controls if you are having to do disturbance activities. And then also being aware of your regulations. We're here actually in a floodplain wetland. We're even in the regulatory floodway of the Clinch River, so being aware and planning, if you do have management activities, of what your regulations are going to be, planning with working within those. Again, contacting your state and local officials before you undertake an activity is very important. And this, again, is just an example here of some things that may not look disturbed at first glance, but still can contribute that sediment, which we know is a major contributor to the decline of hellbenders and other aquatic wildlife. So far we've seen an example of a good, intact, forested riparian buffer. We've seen one buffer that's forested but has had some disturbance in the understory that is potentially causing some issues for water quality. And thought I would point this site out where we really don't have much of a buffer at all. We're actually in a developed kind of town park, urban setting on the outside of town, but it's a great example, as you can see behind me, from where most of the trees are gone. There's a few trees left, a little bit of vegetation, but for the most part, the forested buffer that used to be here is cleared. We've got kind of an open lawn type habitat, and as you can see behind me, also some pretty severe stream bank erosion is happening, and the stream banks are failing. The main reason this happens is when you don't have that vegetation there, especially not the larger tree roots that are helping to anchor that topsoil in place. It becomes a lot more likely during a flood event for the bank to fail, and then the topsoil, the sediment that was here, eventually going straight into the waterway. So not only do you lose that stream bank, but you also contribute sediment pollution to the waterway. And this is not a one-time problem. As long as this is here and it's not remediated, each successive flood event has the risk of eating further and further back into that bank, causing the banks to slump and then eventually fail and then slide down into the waterway. This actually, even though it looks pretty bad, is a relatively minor example. We have some places where I work, for example, in other parts of the region where the stream bank erosion is so severe, it's taller than me. So you've got 7 to 8 feet, pretty much just a scarp of that stream bank, where the stream is becoming what we call over-widened. That influences the hydrological characteristics, contributes to more water pollution, and so on. So if you have this type of situation on your property, a lot of times we see this where historically pastures, for example, have been cleared all the way up to the waterway. There are options to restore this, and unfortunately it requires significantly more cost and a lot more effort to restore a situation like this, but it is possible. And this is where, if you're interested in that, it's important to consult with some experts that are trained and have the resources and how to do this appropriately. There are considerations, for example, about what vegetation you plant, how you plant it, when you plant it, and then also making sure that you restore and prep the site appropriately before you plant that vegetation, so that the stream banks are anchored in place and you don't actually exacerbate an existing problem. But this is kind of the best case or worst case scenario for what not to look for, what you don't want to see along a stream bank. And this is really, at least immediately close to the waterway, what is contributing to that sediment and then causing a lot of issues for wildlife. It really goes back to how we're treating the land and what's happening immediately close to the stream bank itself. And so lastly, I just want to emphasize that riparian buffer protection is not just something for our larger rivers and streams. It is critical there, but sedimentation, water quality issues, they ultimately start upstream, especially in smaller tributaries that eventually flow into those larger rivers. And we're at a good example here. We're at a small tributary called Lick Creek that enters into the main stem of the Clinch River. And even a site like this, it's important to think about on your property. What are your riparian buffers? What's their condition? How could you possibly improve those? Even something like a small headwater stream is critical, because ultimately what happens in those streams is going to flow downstream into a larger waterway and then eventually into our larger rivers where some of our more sensitive aquatic critters are going to live. And like I mentioned earlier at the start of this video, some researchers from Virginia Tech are finding that with Eastern Hellbenders, it's not just what's happening in the river, but it's also what's happening in the broader catchment, that broader watershed with land use. How much forest cover do we have? They're finding that that is actually impacting the net success of hellbenders, what could be miles and miles downstream of where disturbance is happening. So just want to close by mentioning, even if you don't have a large river on your property, if you have any stream, even a small headwater stream, protecting and restoring buffers along that stream is going to be a critical management practice. As I mentioned a couple of times as well, just be sure if you are undertaking any kind of riparian buffer improvement, to run that by your local extension agent, talk to them, your local USDA office. Make sure you're doing that appropriately, that you have the expertise and permits required to do that in the right way. But protecting these buffers, no matter how large or how small the stream, is really a critical practice to help preserve not only our water quality, but also the habitat for some of Virginia's most important wildlife.
I want to thank Dr. Wally Smith with the University of Virginia at Wise for joining us in today's episode. I also want to thank all of you for joining today's broadcast. Tune in again for future editions of 15 Minutes in the Forest.